Hello, and let's get started on social exchange theory. I think you're going to find this one pretty easy to understand, and I can guarantee you've already been exhibiting some aspects of social exchange theory today. So the easiest way to summarize social exchange theory is just the weighing of pros and cons, which we all do every day. And I bet you can think of some moments that you've weighed the pros and cons already today, like the pros and cons of getting your schoolwork done now versus earlier or later, or the pros and cons of exercise, or the pros and cons of eating a treat, or the pros and cons of driving versus biking, or saying something to someone versus not saying something to someone. So social exchange theory is one of the theories that started elsewhere and then moved into the field of family studies. So it started as in the fields of philosophy and economics, this idea that individuals rationally weigh the rewards and costs associated with their choices and then try to maximize their rewards and profit and minimize their costs or risks. And Nye was the one who is credited with applying the concept of utilitarianism or the philosophy of utilitarianism to the family. Here's the basic assumptions of social exchange theory. So the first one is that people are motivated by self-interest. So the idea that we all seek things or relationships or experiences that benefit us. Sometimes this is subconscious. Even, for example, altruism can be conceptualized by this theory as a form of self-interest, because maybe I want other people to think that I'm helpful, or I want to preserve a self-image of myself as kind. That we can predict by understanding the individual actor's motivation. So we can all be motivated by different things. So some people have children because for them, the rewards outweigh the costs, or for others who might be more motivated by money, they may take a job that they don't like. So once I understand you and I understand that you're more motivated by money, I could predict that you might take a job that you don't like. Actors are rational, and this is necessary according to the theory to calculate the ratio of cost to rewards. But as we will see, being rational in human relationships can be challenging. And then lastly, social relationships are interdependent. So in order to get from others, we basically have to give to them. We can't just take. So even though we are trying to maximize our rewards and minimize our costs, we have to interact or exchange with others in order to do that. Okay, so rewards are anything that's perceived by someone as beneficial. And we're going to have an upcoming slide that gives kind of examples of rewards and costs. Costs are basically the opposite of a reward. And the profit is the ratio of rewards to costs. So in any situation, we calculate the profit for all of our options. So for example, let's say you're deciding between two jobs. You might list the rewards, like how much money I make, how many hours I have to work, how easy is the job, how much freedom or autonomy you have, and then you would list the costs of all those. And so it could be that you have to work 8 to 5 and you don't have any flexibility, or the job is really hard. And so if you're deciding between two, you take the rewards for each one and minus the cost, and then decide based on the profit. So you wouldn't just decide only based on rewards, because maybe one job offers you a lot more money, but it's terrible working conditions. And the other job actually is less financially rewarding, but because the costs are lower, the profit is higher. Okay, so comparison level and comparison level for alternatives. These are pretty challenging to understand, but they're important to know for an exam. Okay, so comparison level is how we compare ourselves to others who are in a similar situation to us to figure out how profitable our current situation is. So if I was trying to decide how profitable my marriage was, I might compare myself to my friends who are married. Comparison level for alternatives is when we compare ourselves to others who are in an alternate position to determine how profitable our situation is. So in this case, I would compare myself to my single friends and decide, okay, how good do they have it compared to how I have it, to decide how profitable my situation is. And maybe I think things like, wow, they get to date, or maybe I think things like, wow, their financial situation is a lot more challenging with only one earner, right? Okay. Then exchanges interdependence is just like that idea of the proposition that we have to kind of exchange or be interdependent with others in order to maximize our profits. And then go ahead and watch this video clip from The Big Bang as an example of the norm of reciprocity. But this is really exemplified by the "you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours," which over time could look at like generalized reciprocity or exchange, which basically means maybe we're not equal right now, but over time we will be. So the example here might be, I put my partner through grad school. I'm the one kind of working and earning all the money. He's doing what he wants to be doing in grad school, but I'm doing that because later I think he's going to get a good job and that's going to benefit me. So it might not be fair right then or reciprocal, but it could be later. And then the last one is equity or fairness, which is just a key part of the theory, in that we, as we'll see, we tend to think equity is rewarding, and we tend to want fairness in relationships. Even kids, right? And really value fairness. Those of you taking care of little kids have undoubtedly heard, that's not fair, which was my favorite refrain growing up. So here are the most common sources of rewards and costs, and there can be others besides this. So social approval, right? There's lots of decisions that we make, and some carry with them social approval and some do not. So you may have noticed this when you tell people that you're attending college, that they like to hear that, right? That often brings social approval. Not with everyone, but with lots of people. Or getting married at the right age. People are happy and approve of that. And so that when you have social approval, it can be kind of be a hidden, or sometimes not so hidden, pro on your pro-con list. Autonomy is another source of rewards and costs. And so we know that, for example, autonomy and flexibility are one of the biggest things that people want in their work, oftentimes even more than money, is to be able to be more in control or have more flexibility in when, where, and how they work. Unambiguity is more of a source of reward than ambiguity. So just like we talked about in family stress theory, ambiguity, or things that are unclear, are more stressful. So for example, I had a graduate student in marriage and family therapy moving to Boston, and she had 2 job offers, one where the hours and the money were very clear, and one in which the amount of money and hours was unknown but potentially high. It was like you could work 20 to 40 hours, you could make a little bit of money or a ton of money. And she found the ambiguous offer too costly, right? Not at a lower profit than the one that was more clear, even though she stood to maybe earn more money in the ambiguous job, but choosing that was just too challenging. Okay, so security. I think we can often relate to staying in relationships or jobs that aren't ideal, but that are safe or secure for us. Values. We tend to like to make decisions that are congruent with our beliefs or values. So choosing between two potential partners that we have kind of chemistry with or that we enjoy, we might choose the person who's more congruent value-wise. If I'm taking a job in public policy, I might prefer to have a job that's in line with my political views versus not. And then equality or equity, as we've kind of talked about already, we find that fairness and equality are rewarding. So maybe you've had the experience of initially feeling happy with the salary that you're earning, but then if you find out that you're making less money than your coworkers, then suddenly it feels less rewarding and more costly. And then lastly, money's a pretty obvious source of reward. Here's theoretical propositions for social exchange theory. So the first one, actors in a situation will choose whatever behavior maximizes profit. It's kind of like we've already talked about, that you're maximizing your profit, which is rewards minus costs. You're not just maximizing your rewards. So if you were choosing between a job that was 40 hours a week and $400 versus 30 hours a week and $350, you would choose the 30-hour week, $350 job because it's more profitable, even though the 40-hour-a-week job has a higher financial reward. The second one, when there are no rewards, you seek to minimize costs. So this is basically choosing the least worst option. So as a parent, maybe after dinner, I wish I could just sit around and watch TV, but I can't. I have to choose between putting the kids to bed or doing the dishes. And depending upon the day, sometimes the least costly seems like it's doing the dishes, and other days the least costly option seems like it's putting the kids to bed. The third one, if short-term profits are equal, then you choose what benefits you the long term. So if you're deciding on what to major in college and you think, gosh, I would really enjoy being an English major or an HDFS major equally, for these 4 years, what would be better for me in the long term for my career? Or vice versa with the short-term profit, maybe I'm deciding between getting a bachelor's degree from Colorado State University or Florida State University. And in the long term, I think they're going to be just fine for me. So where do I want to live in the short term, Fort Collins or Tallahassee? So equity theory is a variation of social exchange theory. And I wouldn't ever ask you to know the difference between social exchange and equity theory, but I'm going to talk about it just in case you run across it when you're writing your theory paper article. So this just goes further with that idea of equity or fairness is in and of itself a reward, that fair exchanges are perceived as more profitable or beneficial. Equity theory is unique in that the unit of analysis is both relationship partners. So whereas in social exchange, it's more about just the individual, in equity theory, it's taking into account, two people at least, and thinking about how one person's kind of what they're putting into it versus what they're getting out compares to what the other person is getting into it and what they're getting out of it. But like you've maybe learned in other HDFS classes, perception might matter more than reality. So you may have learned, for example, in terms of how a couple might divide up household labor, that what actually matters more is it's not how many hours each person does, but how fair they perceive it to be. So here's an example of a research study that used equity theory. So it was studying mothers and their adult children. And so again, equity theory suggests that relationships are better, right, when both members of the relationship or the dyad perceive that their exchanges are fair or think their exchanges are fair. Most of the research that's been done goes with kind of the level or frequency of exchange, like what each person actually does in terms of behavior, maybe in providing support. And so this study sought to figure out, was it the actual kind of whether or not you were more balanced in how much you listened to each other or helped each other or supported each other, or was it more about perception? And so this was a little over 1,400 mother, adult, child dyads, and they only gathered information from mothers, so it was a little bit of a weakness in the study. But basically what they found was that mothers' perceptions of equity were better predictors of closeness and tension in the relationship than mothers saying we have really balanced exchanges in terms of the depth and frequency. So again, it's more evidence for perception than reality. Social exchange theory has also used to theoretically explain some gender differences in sexual behavior. So in many cultures, on average, males seem to seek sex more actively than females, at least earlier on in life. And so if we assume that the biological drive for sex is equal for the genders, then how do we explain this difference? So social exchange theory would say maybe there's more costs for women and more rewards for men. So women have more responsibility for child raising. Women are the only ones who can be pregnant. Contraception is left to women typically. Cisgender males are more likely to achieve orgasm than are cisgender females. And so maybe overall, sex is more satisfying for cisgender males than it is for cisgender females. Researchers have also used social exchange theory to understand caregiving relationships. So more specifically thinking about family caregivers of older adults. So maybe you're caring for your older adult spouse or your older adult parent. And so a couple of concepts from social exchange theory that readily apply. The first one is interdependence, right? We have to depend on exchanges with others to get the things that we value. And also that idea of generalized exchange, that exchanges can happen over time. And so, maybe one thing that's motivating our caregiving for this older adult is that they showed us care earlier in life. And we could imagine that if they didn't do a good job of sharing us or, showing us care earlier in life and being a good caregiver, then that may make it harder and seem less rewarding for us to be doing that for them. So caregiver burden then can be conceptualized basically as negative profit when the costs to caregiving, whether that's emotional, physical, financial, begin to outweigh any perceived rewards at that time or over time. So relationship satisfaction, closeness, or, this sense that I am paying you back. Social exchange theory also underpins some clinical interventions. So Patterson's behavioral exchange approach uses that concept of norm of reciprocity and theorizes why dysfunctional patterns often arise between, for example, parents and kids, is that they keep basically exchanging negative consequences. So you give me a cost or a negative consequence, and I'm going to give you one back. And so then therapists need to help family members increase their positive or rewarding exchanges and decrease their negative exchanges. Markman's PrEP approach, it's basically a very similar idea that couples can have a more positive or negative norm of reciprocity where they're exchanging back and forth, and so we need to move them to more positive exchanges. And then you may have already learned about John Gottman's 5-to-1 ratio, which is basically that Gottman found that in couples who stay together over the long term, there's a ratio of at least 5 positives for each 1 negative. And so that's kind of that idea of profit, right? Reward minus cost equals profit. And so every time there's a negative, it doesn't have to be huge. It could be something like a rolling of your eyes, a sigh, an irritated look. For every one of those, a couple needs to have 5 little positive things like a smile, laughing at your joke, a pat on the back, things like that. So this theory is really all about individual motivation to maximize profit. But what about, for example, true altruistic behavior where someone's, falling on a grenade to save others? That really can't be explained by this theory. There's also the challenge of that rational actor in an emotional family. So what happens when your partner makes a face that triggers kind of a memory of how the face that your mother used to make when you were in trouble and you kind of react in a intense way? Are you really being rational, or is this a more primitive emotional process? Tautology or circular reasoning, this exists when terms are all defined by one another and there's no real possibility of disproving a statement. And so if each person is motivated by different rewards, how can we really prove that anyone ever makes a decision that doesn't maximize their profit? So this is something that would be challenging to test in the theory.